He thought the creek held only silence, until a tiny cry shattered his world. Mason Reed never expected that a single moment would change everything he knew about life, loss, and love. A baby girl, abandoned and barely alive, would lead him into a fight that could cost more than he was ready to give. Tell us where you're watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Watch closely. Every second matters in this unforgettable tale. I never believed life could give me a second chance. Not after everything I'd lost. Not after the fire that took Emily and our baby boy from me 10 years ago. Since that day, I'd lived like a man half dead, working the ranch, fixing fences, keeping my head down, and speaking to no one unless I had to. The land doesn't care if you're broken. It demands your sweat either way. And I gave it, because that was all I had left to give. That morning started like any other. The sun was just crawling over the hills, painting the Texas sky with that pale orange light that only ranch country knows. I saddled up Thunder, my old horse, and set out along the creek line to check the fencing. It was routine, mindless work, the kind of work that kept me from thinking too much about the past. But fate doesn't ask permission before it changes your life. I spotted it first as just another piece of trash drifting along the slow-moving water. Folks upstream tossed all kinds of junk in the creek. Broken bottles, old rags, busted sacks. I almost rode right past it. But something about the way it shifted in the current made me pull Thunder up short. It was a burlap sack, tied tight with rough rope at the top. Heavier than the current ought to carry. I dismounted, boots sinking into the muddy bank, and waded in. When I hauled that sack up, it pulled against me like it didn't want to leave the water. And then I heard it. A sound so faint I thought at first it was just the wind. But no, the whimper was real. Weak, broken, barely there. My blood ran cold. My hands shook as I tugged at the knot. And when the sack fell open, the world stopped. Inside was a baby girl. Maybe 8, maybe 9 months old. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, her little body cold as river stone. She should have been gone already. By all rights, she shouldn't have been breathing at all. But when she looked up at me with eyes too old for her tiny face, she whispered one word. Mama! I can't explain what that did to me. It was like my chest split open, and all the grief I'd buried for a decade came pouring out. I saw my own son in her face, heard echoes of his cries on that night I couldn't save him. But this time I had a chance. I wrapped her in my coat, pressed her against me, and swung back onto Thunder's saddle. I'd ridden that horse 1,000 times before, but never like that morning. The world blurred into streaks of brown and gold as we tore across the prairie toward town. Every jolt of Thunder's stride felt like time slipping through my fingers. The baby's breathing was shallow, ragged, as if death itself was riding at our heels. Hold on, little one, I kept whispering. Just hold on. I wasn't praying. I'd stopped praying long ago, but I begged anyway. Begged anyone listening, God or ghost, to let me be in time. By the time Main Street came into view, the baby's grip on my shirt had weakened to almost nothing. Her eyes fluttered closed, her breath a whisper of a whisper. I thought I'd lost her right there, thought the creek had won. But then her little hand twitched against my chest, and I spurred Thunder harder. Dr. Michael Stone's office sat at the corner, white paint peeling, a red cross on the door. I'd been there once years back for stitches, but I'd never stepped inside since. Didn't much like doctors. Didn't much like people, truth be told. But that day, none of it mattered. I burst through his door like a madman, clutching that bundle in my arms like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. Doc, I rasped, my throat raw from the ride. You've got to help. I found her in the creek. She's barely breathing. and as I laid her down on the examination table, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever this was, whoever she was, my life would never be the same again. The room smelled of coffee and antiseptic, that sharp sting of medicine I'd never grown used to. Dr. Stone looked up from his cup, his eyes narrowing at the sight of me. I must have looked like death itself had chased me inside, mud-smeared, sweat-soaked, clutching that trembling bundle as though I could hold back the Reaper with my bare hands. He didn't waste a second. For all his years and the lines etched deep into his face, Dr. Stone moved with the urgency of a man half his age. "On the table," he barked, already tossing aside his cup. His voice left no room for argument, and I obeyed, laying her down gently on the worn oak surface. For the first time, under the glow of the kerosene lamp, I saw just how fragile she really was. Her skin had the pale sheen of candle wax, her lips a faint shade of purple. Her chest rose and fell so shallow I thought each breath might be her last. My hands that had built fences, broken horses, worked calloused and strong, shook like dry leaves. I wanted to do something, anything, but all I could do was stand there and watch as Dr. Stone pressed his stethoscope against her tiny chest. His brows knit together, his jaw tightening. "She's hypothermic," he muttered. "Body temperature dangerously low. She's dehydrated, too. But she's alive. Alive." That word hit me like a blow and a blessing all at once. She was alive, but only just. He worked in silence for what felt like hours. Warm blankets, gentle hands, checking her pulse, listening again and again to that fragile heartbeat. I paced the room, back and forth like a caged animal, listening for each tiny sound she made. Every whimper was a lifeline. Every silence was a knife to my gut. Memories I'd buried deep clawed their way back into me. I saw smoke again, thick and choking, flames devouring wood. I heard Emily's screams, my boy's small cries. I remembered pounding against a locked door, the heat too fierce, the world collapsing around me. I hadn't been fast enough then. I hadn't been strong enough. And I'd sworn never to let my heart open again, never to love something I could lose. But there she was, fighting on that table, and all my vows shattered in the span of a heartbeat. The door creaked open behind me, and a soft voice broke the silence. "Dr. Stone, is everything all right?" It was Grace Harper, the schoolteacher. I knew her by sight. Everyone in town did. She carried herself with quiet dignity, a woman marked by loss. I remembered hearing whispers years back about her husband dying in a mine collapse, about a baby girl she'd buried not long after. Folks said she kept to herself after that, pouring her love into her students but never letting anyone too close. She stepped inside, her eyes falling on the bundle of blankets and frail limbs on the table. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment I thought she might faint. Dr. Stone looked up sharply. "Grace, thank God. I need your help. This baby needs constant care, round-the-clock feeding, warmth, someone to keep her alive. I can't do it alone, not with other patients waiting. You're the only one I trust for this." I bristled, instinct flaring. "I can handle it." My voice was rough, almost a growl, though I knew even as I spoke that my hands betrayed me, trembling, unsteady. Grace's gaze flicked to me, then back to the child. She hesitated, her whole body taut with an unseen battle. I didn't know then what demons clawed at her, but I saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of the baby, but fear of what holding her might mean. Still, she stepped closer, slow as if approaching a wounded animal. When Dr. Stone finally placed the child into her arms, something changed in the air. The baby, who had been restless, weak, whimpering, suddenly grew calm. Her tiny fist curled around Grace's finger, her eyes opening just enough to gaze upward. and for the first time since I'd pulled her from the creek, her lips twitched in something like peace. Grace froze, as though she'd been struck by lightning. Her shoulders shook, tears streaming down her face before she even realized it. She began to hum then, low and soft, a melody so fragile it seemed to rise from somewhere buried deep in her bones. A lullaby, broken and mended in the same breath. The baby sighed, a sound too small for such a heavy room, and drifted into a quiet sleep. I watched, unable to speak. Something inside me shifted, an old wound stirring. I had thought no light could ever seep into the cavern where my heart once beat. But seeing that woman cradle that dying child, seeing the child surrender her fight to Grace's arms, something cracked open in me. The next hours passed in a blur. Dr. Stone gave instructions, rapid and clear, feeding every 2 hours, keeping her warm, watching for signs of fever or pneumonia. Grace listened, her teacher's focus sharp, though her eyes never left the little face nestled against her. And me. I stood there, restless, pacing, feeling both helpless and bound to that child by chains I couldn't explain. She wasn't mine, not by blood, not by name. But when I thought of losing her, I felt the same cold dread that had stalked me through nightmares for a decade. I told myself it was just because I'd found her, because she reminded me of the boy I lost. But deep down I knew better. In less than a day, she had become the axis my world spun on. And I had no idea then that saving her would put me on a collision course with the most powerful man in town, a man who'd stop at nothing to reclaim what he thought was his. The night after we pulled her from the creek was the longest of my life. I'd fought blizzards, floods, and droughts that could starve a man's land to dust, but nothing ever made me feel so powerless as watching that child's tiny chest rise and fall, never knowing if each breath might be her last. We set up in the back room of Dr. Stone's office, a small space lined with shelves of dusty books and jars filled with remedies I couldn't pronounce. Grace settled into the old rocking chair by the lamp, holding the baby close to her chest, as if she'd been born for this moment. I stayed standing, pacing the floor, every board creaking under my boots. Every few minutes Grace would whisper a soft word, adjust the blanket, or lift a bottle to the baby's lips. I don't know how she managed it, but the little one seemed to listen, her cries softening each time Grace's voice touched the air. I tried to help once, offered to hold the bottle myself, but the child turned her face away, whimpering until Grace took her back. It stung more than I expected. She was just a baby, barely clinging to life, and yet she already knew where she belonged. Not with me. I spent most of the night by the window, staring out at the moonlit street. The town lay silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching. Maybe it was just the way my nerves were strung tight, but I knew enough about life to understand that no baby winds up tied in a sack in a creek by accident. Someone wanted her gone. Someone had tried to erase her. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, she was alive, and in my arms. Toward dawn, Grace's humming slowed. Her head drooped forward, exhaustion pulling her down. I should have told her to rest, should have taken the child from her arms. But when I saw the way she held that baby, like she was holding on to her own salvation, I couldn't bring myself to break it. Instead, I sat in the shadows, letting memories claw at me again. I saw Emily's smile, the way she used to hum as she baked bread in the kitchen. I heard my son's laugh, high and free, echoing in the barn. Then I saw the fire, the smoke, the loss. And now I saw a tiny girl sleeping against Grace's chest, her fragile breath stirring the air like a prayer I didn't dare speak aloud. When morning came, Dr. Stone returned, weary but sharp-eyed. He examined the child, listened to her chest again, and finally gave a small nod. She's stronger. The fever hasn't set in. That's a good sign. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath until then. But the old man's next words sliced through that relief. "The question is, what now?" Grace looked up at him, her arms tightening protectively around the child. "She needs care. She needs a home." "A home," I echoed, my voice low. The word felt foreign on my tongue. Dr. Stone studied me with that sharp look he always carried, the kind that saw more than a man wanted to show. "Mason, you found her. That counts for something. But raising a baby is more than keeping her fed and warm. It's more than fixing fences and breaking horses." I stiffened. "You think I don't know that?" "I think you know better than most what it means to lose one," he said softly. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Grace's gaze shifted between us, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Sorrow, maybe, or understanding too deep for words. Finally, she spoke. "It doesn't matter whose arms she rests in, so long as she lives. That's what matters now." The truth of it cut through all my stubborn pride. Still, I couldn't let it rest. But what happens when someone comes looking? What happens when the person who tried to drown her realizes she survived? Grace flinched, clutching the baby tighter. Dr. Stone's expression darkened. "That's a danger we can't ignore." I wanted to believe it was just a cruel accident, some desperate soul who'd lost their mind. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't desperation. It was intent. And intent like that doesn't just vanish. The child stirred, her tiny fist reaching out, brushing against Grace's collar. Grace kissed the top of her head, and for the briefest moment, a smile broke through her tears. Something twisted inside me then. A vow I hadn't spoken aloud yet, but one I knew was already etched into my bones. Whoever had tried to take her life, they'd have to go through me if they ever tried again. The rest of that day passed in uneasy quiet. I fetched supplies, wood for the stove, blankets from the ranch. Grace refused to leave the child's side, and I didn't argue. We worked in silence, two broken souls circling the fragile light of new life, neither daring to admit what it was doing to us. But as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the prairie, I felt it again, that prickle on the back of my neck. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm, though peace would have been the wrong word for it. Peace was something I hadn't felt in over a decade, and even now, with that child cradled against Grace's heart, I felt only the fragile edge of it, like walking a frozen river, knowing one wrong step could send us all beneath the ice. Grace and I became unlikely partners. She handled the baby with a tenderness that made me ache in ways I couldn't name. Every cry, every whimper, she answered with patience, her voice soft as snowfall. I'd never seen anyone so attuned to another soul. Watching her, I realized this wasn't just duty for her. It was something deeper, something that pulled from the marrow of her bones. And me. I became the provider. If she needed wood for the stove, I chopped it. If she needed milk or broth, I fetched it. I made sure the fire never went out, that the blankets stayed warm, that the world outside never breached the thin walls of Dr. Stone's back room. I didn't know how to hold the child the way Grace did, not without her crying, but I could build a fortress around them both. That was something I understood. At night, when the baby finally slept, Grace and I would sit in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. Silence wasn't uncomfortable between us. It was heavy, yes, but not empty. It carried all the words we didn't dare say aloud. One evening, as the prairie wind howled against the shutters, Grace finally asked the question I knew had been circling her thoughts. "Why did you bring her here, Mason? You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." Her voice was quiet, but steady. She wasn't accusing me. She was searching for something. I stared at the flames licking the stove. I couldn't. That's not an answer. My hands tightened into fists. I hated talking about the past, hated dragging those ghosts into the open. But her eyes, there was something in them that made the words crawl up my throat despite myself. Because I lost mine, I said, rough and clipped. My boy, my wife. Fire took them, took everything, and I swore I'd never. My voice caught, the rest of the vow choking me. Never put myself through that again. Silence stretched. Grace's face softened, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She didn't ask for more. She didn't pity me. She simply nodded, as though she carried her own graveyard of memories too heavy to dig through. Later that night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her humming again. Not just for the baby this time, but for herself. The tune carried sorrow, yes, but also strength. And in that dim glow, I realized we were two broken people bound by the same scar, loss. But scars don't always keep you apart. Sometimes, they stitch you together. It was on the fourth morning that the world shifted. I had gone out early, the sun barely grazing the horizon, to fetch water from the pump behind the doctor's office. The air was crisp, my breath turning to frost as I worked the handle. And that's when I saw him, a stranger, leaning against the hitching post across the street. He wasn't from town. I knew every face within 20 miles, and his was as foreign as the cut of his coat. Fine wool, dark, too clean for a man who'd worked the land. He watched me with eyes sharp as a hawk's, the brim of his hat shadowing most of his face. I tried to ignore him, filled the bucket, and headed back inside. But the hairs on my neck rose, the same prickle I'd felt that night by the window. He was watching, measuring. Inside, I set the water down and told Grace. She stiffened instantly, clutching the baby closer. "You think he's here for her?" she whispered. I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe it was coincidence. But in my gut, I already knew the truth. Men like him didn't wander into towns like ours without purpose. All day I caught glimpses of him, by the saloon, near the general store, at the edge of the blacksmith's yard. Always close enough to see us, never close enough to approach. He was waiting. By sundown, I couldn't take it any more. I walked across the street, shoulders squared, jaw tight, ready for a fight if he wanted one. He didn't move as I stopped in front of him, just tilted his head, those hawk eyes narrowing. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice like gravel. He smiled, slow and cold. "Maybe you can. I'm looking for something. Or rather, someone." My chest tightened. "And who might that be?" His gaze slid past me, toward the doctor's office window, where the faint glow of a lamp spilled into the street. I knew what he was looking at, who he was looking for. "That," he said softly, "is none of your concern. Unless, of course, you've seen a child recently. A little girl, perhaps." My hands curled into fists, but I forced my face to remain stone. "Can't say I have." His smile widened, though it never touched his eyes. "Funny thing about lies, mister." "Mason," I growled. "Mason," he repeated, rolling the name on his tongue like he was testing it. "Funny thing about lies, they tend to unravel faster than the truth." We stood there, silence stretching taut as a noose. Then, with a tip of his hat, he turned and walked away, boots crunching against the dirt road. But I knew he'd be back. And I knew, without a shred of doubt, that the fight for that child's life had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time the fire popped in the stove, My hand went to the rifle leaning against the wall. Grace and the baby slept in the chair again, the little one's head nestled under her chin, both of them breathing in fragile rhythm. I stayed by the window, staring at the street below, waiting for the hawk-eyed stranger to reappear. He didn't. But the absence was worse. Men like him didn't just vanish. If he wasn't outside, he was somewhere else, and that meant he was moving pieces I couldn't see. By morning, the town was buzzing. You could feel it in the air, the way people spoke in hushed voices at the general store, the way eyes darted toward the saloon and back again. Word had spread that a man was asking questions. Not about cattle, not about work, not about land. About a baby. And in a place like this, where everyone knew everyone, that was the kind of question that didn't just raise eyebrows. It sharpened them. I went into town to buy supplies and heard two ranch hands talking near the smithy. Heard he came in on the coach 2 nights back. Paid double for the seat. Money like that don't come from nowhere. He's hunting something. Hunting someone, the other corrected, lowering his voice. A child. The words coiled around my spine like barbed wire. When I returned to the doctor's office, Grace was standing near the stove, her face pale. "He came here," she whispered before I even shut the door. My stomach dropped. What did he say? He asked if anyone had been seen with a newborn. Said he was looking for family. But the way he asked, Mason, it wasn't family. It was something else. I cursed under my breath. So he'd come sniffing at the door already. That meant time was short. Grace clutched the baby tighter. What if he goes to the sheriff? The sheriff's a drunk, I said. And a coward. If there's money involved, he'll side with whoever's paying. Her eyes widened. Then what do we do? That was the question gnawing at me, and I didn't have a good answer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, take Grace and the baby, ride out before the stranger had time to tighten the noose. But running meant leaving everything behind. And worse, it meant admitting this wasn't just some accident we'd stumbled into. It meant this child had enemies powerful enough to send men across counties, maybe states, to finish what they'd started in that creek. That night, after Grace and the baby finally drifted off, I sat alone at the table, staring at the flame in the lamp. My fists clenched, jaw tight. I wrestled with the truth. I wasn't ready for this. Not again. Not after what I'd lost. I'd sworn I'd never open that wound. And yet, here I was, ready to bleed for a child who wasn't even mine. The door creaked. Grace's soft footsteps crossed the floor. She didn't say anything at first, just poured herself a glass of water, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked tired, bone-deep tired, but her eyes held fire. "You're thinking of leaving," she said. Not a question. I didn't answer. She set the glass down. "If you're going to run, Mason, then run. But I won't. That baby's not leaving my arms. Not for him. Not for anyone." Her voice trembled, but her hands didn't. She meant every word. Something in me broke then, or maybe it healed. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. All I knew was that the choice I'd been circling, the one I'd been too much of a coward to make, suddenly became clear. "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice low but certain. Grace blinked, as if she hadn't expected it. Then her shoulders loosened, and for the first time in days, I saw relief in her eyes. We sat in silence a long while after that, the kind of silence that settles when two people realize they're standing on the same side of the line. The next day, the stranger made his move. He walked into the saloon around noon, broad daylight, like he owned the place. I was already there, keeping watch, nursing a glass of whiskey I didn't intend to finish. The room fell quiet the moment he stepped in, his boots clicking against the floorboards. He looked around slowly, eyes sweeping over the men at the tables, the bartender polishing glasses, the cards scattered mid-game. Finally, his gaze landed on me. "Mason," he said, as though greeting an old friend. I didn't move. "Don't remember giving you my name." "You did," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Last night." He walked to the bar, ordered a drink, then turned his body just enough to face me. "You strike me as a man who knows how to mind his own business. Most days. And yet," he said, swirling the amber in his glass, "here we are talking again. Fate, maybe. I don't believe in fate." He chuckled softly. "Neither do I. I believe in money, and men who know when to take it." He set a folded bill on the counter, crisp and thick. "More than a ranch hand would see in a year. There's more where that came from," he said, his voice low enough only I could hear. "All I need is information. A simple yes or no. Has anyone in this town been seen with a baby?" The saloon was quiet, but the air around us hummed with tension. Every man within earshot was listening, waiting. I stared at that bill, then back at him. "No." He studied me, his smile fading just a fraction. He could tell I wasn't lying, not with my words, but with the steel in my eyes. And that unsettled him. "Well," he said finally, lifting his glass, "I suppose time will tell." He drank, set the glass down, and walked out, leaving the bill on the counter. I didn't touch it. Neither did anyone else. As I watched him disappear into the sunlight, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a man who gave up easy. And sooner or later, he'd come knocking again. Harder. The stranger didn't come back to the saloon the next day. Or the one after. That should have eased my mind, but it didn't. Wolves don't walk away from fresh tracks. They circle, biding their time. And every hour he stayed out of sight, my nerves frayed a little thinner. Grace tried to keep things normal, though what passed for normal anymore was a life measured in small mercies. The baby's laugh when she gurgled against Grace's shoulder, the brief moments of warmth when the three of us sat near the stove, the soft sound of Grace's humming lulling the little one to sleep. Those moments were like fragile glass, beautiful, but ready to shatter at the first stone thrown. On the third night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not in the street. Not on the boardwalk. On the porch. I was up in an instant, rifle in hand, eyes darting to Grace. She was already awake, clutching the baby to her chest, her face pale in the lamplight. The door creaked. A shadow passed over the window. "Stay back," I whispered, raising the rifle. Then, silence. The footsteps retreated. A low chuckle drifted through the wall, cold and sharp, before fading into the night. The next morning I found it, a mark carved into the doorframe. Just a shallow cut, but deliberate. A message, plain as day. "I know you're in there." I ground my teeth until my jaw ached. Enough waiting. Enough hiding. If the stranger wanted to play, then he'd learn that some men don't scare easy. I saddled my horse and rode out to the edge of town, following the faint trail of boot prints that led into the cottonwoods. Took me less than an hour to find his camp. He wasn't alone. Two men sat near the fire, rough-looking types with revolvers on their hips. One was sharpening a knife, the other cleaning his gun. And the stranger, hawk-eyed, calm as ever, was seated with his back to me. Sipping coffee from a tin cup like this was just another day in paradise. I could have taken him right then, put a bullet between his shoulders and ended it before it began. But there were two problems with that. First, I didn't know who sent him. And second, killing him would bring a storm I wasn't ready for. Men like him didn't travel without a net. Someone, somewhere, would come looking if he didn't return. So I pulled back, slipped through the brush, and rode home. But I made myself a promise. If he stepped 1 foot too close to Grace or the baby, I wouldn't hesitate. That night, the storm came. I was stacking wood behind the doctor's office when I heard the glass shatter. A scream ripped through the night. Grace's voice, raw and terrified. I dropped the logs and ran. The back window was broken, shards glittering on the floor. Grace was in the corner, clutching the baby, while one of the rough-looking men loomed over her, knife in hand. The second stood by the door, revolver drawn. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I raised the rifle and fired. The man by the door went down before he could even turn, the force throwing him against the wall. The one with the knife spun toward me, eyes wide, and lunged. I dropped the rifle, grabbed the barrel, and swung it like a club. The wood cracked against his temple, and he crumpled, the knife skittering across the floor. Grace was crying, the baby wailing in her arms, but they were alive. That was all that mattered. Then I heard it, slow clapping. The stranger stepped through the broken door, calm as ever, his hawk eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Well done, Mason," he said smoothly. "You're every bit the man I was told you were." I raised the rifle again, my finger trembling on the trigger. "One more step, and you won't be walking back out." He didn't move, just tilted his head, studying me like I was some rare animal he'd finally cornered. "You think this ends with me?" he asked. "You think you can hold onto that child forever?" I didn't answer. His smile widened, cruel and patient. "That little girl isn't yours. She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to men far more powerful than you can imagine, and they will never stop coming." "Then let them come," I growled. "They'll meet the same end as your men." For the first time, his smile faltered. Just a flicker. But it was enough. He tipped his hat, calm as a preacher leaving the pulpit, and stepped back into the night. I wanted to chase him, wanted to put a bullet in his spine and end it once and for all. But the sound of Grace sobbing behind me held me still. I turned, and for a moment the sight nearly broke me. Grace on the floor, rocking the baby, tears streaking her cheeks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and desperate. "Mason," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were past the point of hiding. The war for that child's life had begun, and whether I was ready or not, I was standing in the middle of it. And God help the man who tried to take her from us again. I buried the 2 men behind the doctor's office before dawn. Didn't mark the graves. Didn't say a prayer. Men like that had already made their peace with the devil. The whole time my thoughts weren't on them. They were on the hawk-eyed bastard who walked away. He could have killed me. Could have slit Grace's throat and taken the baby. But he didn't. Instead, he'd left me with words. Words sharp enough to keep me awake long after the dirt was packed down. "She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to men far more powerful than you can imagine." That sentence gnawed at me, burrowing deeper each time I replayed it. It wasn't just the threat, it was the certainty in his voice. He knew something I didn't, and that made me dangerous only in the short term. Grace didn't sleep at all. She sat by the stove with the baby in her arms, eyes red, body trembling. She wouldn't let the child out of her sight, not even for a moment. By morning, she looked like a ghost, hollowed out, but clinging stubbornly to the one thing that kept her standing. "We can't stay here," she said hoarsely as the first light crept through the window. "I know. They'll send more. I know that too." She stared at me, waiting for more. For a plan, for a promise. something solid she could anchor herself to. But the truth was, I didn't have one. Instead, I went to the only man in town who might know more than he let on, the preacher. Reverend Caleb was an old crow of a man, sharp-eyed despite his years, with a tongue that cut both ways. He'd buried half the county, baptized the other half, and kept their secrets in between. If anyone knew who was moving shadows behind this child, it would be him. I found him in the chapel, sweeping the aisle. "You're early," he said without looking up. "I need answers." His broom paused. Then he leaned it against a pew and straightened. "This about the child?" I froze. "You know." He sighed, running a hand through his thin grey hair. "Word travels. Faster than you think." "Then tell me," I demanded, stepping closer. "What's she mixed up in?" He studied me a long time, then gestured to a pew. "Sit." I didn't. He lowered himself onto the bench with a grunt. "Her mother was no ordinary woman, Mason. She came from money, influence, the kind that stretches beyond counties, beyond states. But she ran from it. Ran from promises she didn't want to keep." "What kind of promises?" "The kind sealed in blood." I didn't like the way his voice dropped when he said it. "The baby's father?" I pressed. Caleb shook his head. "A name I won't speak in this house. But I will tell you this. That child carries a legacy powerful men are desperate to control. She isn't just an heir. She's a key. To land, to wealth, maybe more. And men like that don't forgive rebellion." My gut twisted. So it was true. This wasn't random. That baby was a piece on a board I didn't even see, and powerful hands were already moving to snatch her back. Then why send killers instead of lawyers? I asked bitterly. The preacher's eyes hardened. Because when pride and power are at stake, paper doesn't matter. Flesh does. I left the chapel with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The stranger wasn't alone. He was the tip of a spear, and behind him was an army. When I told Grace, she went silent for a long time, just rocking the baby in her arms. Finally, she said, "So what do we do now? Keep running until they catch us." Her words cut me deeper than any knife. "No," I said. "We stop running. We start fighting." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Mason, you can't fight men like that. They have money. They have soldiers. You're just what?" I snapped. "A ranch hand? A drunk? A man who's already buried his own blood and has nothing left to lose." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "That baby," I said, my voice breaking, "she's all I've got now. You think I'm going to let some rich bastard take her? You think I'll stand by and watch her life be stolen before it even begins?" Grace's tears spilled over, and she pressed the baby tighter against her chest. "Then we'll stand with you," she whispered. That night, I prepared for war. I cleaned the rifle, checked the revolver, sharpened the knife. I boarded the broken windows, reinforced the door. Every sound outside, every boot step, every horse snort, every coyote's cry, made my muscles coil. And still, in the back of my mind, the preacher's words echoed. A key. To land, to wealth, maybe more. What kind of child had we stumbled into saving? And how much blood would it cost to keep her safe? The answer came quicker than I expected. 2 nights later, flames lit the horizon. A ranch outside town, the Harris place, burned bright against the sky. People ran, shouting, horses screaming. But I knew before anyone said a word. It wasn't an accident. It was a warning. They weren't just coming for us anymore. They were sending a message to the whole town. And messages like that only meant one thing. The real fight was about to begin. The Harris place was gone by the time I got there. Nothing left but smouldering beams and the sick stench of charred cattle. The fire had been too clean, too deliberate. Whoever lit it knew what they were doing. Every barn, every corral, every outbuilding burned in neat succession. It wasn't rage. It was calculation. I found what was left of Tom Harris by the well. His wife and boy too. Throats cut, not burned. They hadn't even been given the mercy of smoke. By the time I rode back to town, word had already spread. Folks gathered in knots on the boardwalk, whispering, their faces pale as moonlight. Some looked at me as I passed. Some with pity. Some with blame. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. It didn't take long for suspicion to become words. Sheriff Dodd met me in front of the saloon, his badge tarnished but still catching the lantern light. He wasn't a brave man, never had been. He wore his authority like a coat 2 sizes too big. "Mason," he said stiffly, "we need to talk." I dismounted slow, met his eyes. "Talk, then." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the crowd gathering behind him. "People are scared. They think this has something to do with you. With that woman you've been keeping." I felt the weight of their stares. Neighbors, merchants, ranch hands, men and women who'd shared drinks with me, traded goods, passed by me on Sunday mornings. Now they looked at me like I was carrying the plague. "Tell your people the truth," I said coldly. "The Harris family didn't die because of Grace. Or the child. They died because wolves have come to this town, and you're too scared to admit it." Dodd's jaw tightened. "Maybe so. But wolves only circle when they smell meat. And I reckon it's your meat they're after." The crowd murmured. My grip tightened on the rifle slung across my shoulder. "You want me gone," I said flatly. The sheriff didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence spoke louder than any words. Grace was waiting when I returned. She read the truth in my face before I even spoke. Her eyes shimmered with fear, but not surprise. "They're turning against us, aren't they?" "Not all," I said, though I didn't believe it. "But enough." She sank into a chair, clutching the baby to her chest. "Then where do we go?" "There's nowhere left." I didn't answer. My mind was too busy racing ahead, trying to see 10 steps down a path I'd never walked. The preacher's words echoed again. "She's a key. To land, to wealth, maybe more." If these men were willing to slaughter families and burn ranches, then we weren't dealing with bounty hunters anymore. This was bigger, organized, ruthless. And the hawk-eyed stranger, he wasn't just some wandering gun. He was their herald. The fire was his sermon, and the town had heard it clear. That night I tried to sleep, but the silence outside was too sharp, too clean. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the shutters set my nerves on edge. Grace dozed fitfully, the baby restless in her arms. Then, just past midnight, a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. I was on my feet in an instant, revolver drawn. "Who is it?" I barked. A pause. Then a voice, low and steady. "Reverend Caleb." I opened the door a crack. The old preacher stood there, lantern in hand, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said. Inside, he set the lantern on the table and lowered his voice. "They'll keep coming, Mason. You know that. The Harris fire was just the beginning." "I know," I muttered. "But there's more," he went on, leaning closer. I've heard whispers, names. The man behind this isn't just some cattle baron or railroad tycoon. He's bigger. He's tied to bloodlines that go back before this country was even settled. Old money, old power, and he believes that child belongs to him. Grace flinched, clutching the baby tighter. Then what do we do? I demanded. Caleb's eyes, sharp despite his years, bored into mine. You fight. But you don't fight alone. I frowned. Meaning there are still some in this town who haven't forgotten what it means to stand for something. Blacksmith O'Reilly, the Carson brothers, even a few of the ranch hands. They'll fight, if you ask them. But they won't come to you. They're afraid. You'll have to go to them. I rubbed a hand over my face. And if they won't, then you're already dead, Caleb said simply. When he left, I sat in silence a long time. Grace finally whispered, "Do you trust him?" I thought of the preacher's steady eyes, the way he spoke the truth without blinking. I trust that he believes what he says. The next morning, I did as he advised. I went to the blacksmith, the Carson brothers, a handful of men who'd once called me friend. Most turned me away. Some spat at my feet. But a few nodded. A few said they'd stand, if it came to it. It wasn't much. But it was something. By sundown I returned home, weary and heavy-hearted. Grace met me at the door, her face pale. "They were here," she whispered. "Who?" "The stranger. He came while you were gone. He didn't break in, didn't threaten. He just stood there, staring through the window. And then he left." My blood turned to ice. That night, I sat by the door with a rifle across my lap, waiting for footsteps that never came. The fire crackled, the baby whimpered, and Grace's quiet sobs filled the silence. I knew then, with a clarity that burned in my chest, the storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. And when it broke, no one in this town, friend or foe, would come out the same. The first shot came at dawn. I was outside, checking the fence line, when the bullet whistled past my head and split the post beside me. Splinters stung my cheek. I dropped flat, rifle already in hand. 3 riders were cresting the ridge, rifles flashing in the rising sun. They weren't townsfolk. Their coats were too clean, their boots too fine. Hired men, brought in from somewhere else. I squeezed off a shot. One dropped from the saddle. The other 2 spurred their horses, circling wide. The house door slammed open. Grace's voice rang out. "Mason! Inside!" I roared. "Stay down!" I crawled to the trough, braced the rifle, and waited. The riders came again, one from each side, their rifles barking. Glass shattered, wood splintered. The baby wailed from inside. I steadied my breath, lined up the first rider, pulled the trigger. He pitched forward, his horse bolting. The last one turned tail, galloping back up the ridge. I thought about chasing him, thought about silencing him before he could report back. But the sound of Grace sobbing inside pulled me harder than any vengeance. When I stepped through the door, the baby was clutched to her chest, her face streaked with tears. "They won't stop," she whispered. "I know. They'll come back. With more. I know that too." And they did. By midday, word spread through town. Riders were seen on the horizon, a dozen at least. Men who didn't belong. The stranger was with them, hawk-eyed, calm as ever, watching from a distance like a judge waiting for the gavel to fall. I gathered what few allies I had. O'Reilly the blacksmith, shoulders like an ox, hands still scarred from a life at the forge. The Carson brothers, young and reckless, more guts than sense. A couple ranch hands who owed me favors, and Reverend Caleb himself, Bible in one hand, shotgun in the other. 7 men, all told, against at least a dozen, maybe more. We holed up in the livery stable, reinforced the doors with wagons, scattered grain sacks for cover. Ammunition was counted twice, thrice. Each man knew the odds. Each man stayed anyway. Grace wanted to fight too, but I forbade it. "Your fight is here," I told her, pressing the baby into her arms. "You keep her alive, whatever it takes." Her eyes shone with fear and fury, but she nodded. The waiting was the worst part. Hours stretched, nerves fraying with every creak of wood, every gust of wind that rattled the shutters. Finally, just before sunset, they came. The first wave hit hard. Gunfire shattered the quiet evening, bullets ripping through walls and doors. Horses screamed. Men shouted. We fired back, the stable filling with smoke and the sharp tang of powder. O'Reilly dropped one with a clean shot to the chest. The Carson boys hooped like wild men, their rifles cracking in rapid succession. Reverend Caleb knelt in the doorway, whispering prayers between blasts from his shotgun. But they kept coming. More men than we'd counted. More horses. More rifles. A bullet grazed my shoulder, burning like fire. I gritted my teeth, pulled the trigger again, watched another man tumble into the dirt. Then, through the smoke and chaos, I saw him. The stranger. He wasn't firing, wasn't shouting. He just stood at the edge of the street, hands resting casually on his belt, eyes fixed on me. Calm. Patient. Like this was all a game, and he already knew the outcome. Something inside me snapped. I pushed past cover, raised my rifle, sighted down the barrel at his chest, and froze. Not because I couldn't take the shot, but because he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He wanted me to fire. He expected it. And in that moment I realized the truth. He wasn't here to kill me. Not yet. His job was to bleed me, to whittle me down, piece by piece, until I was too broken to protect anyone. I lowered the rifle, swore under my breath, pulled back into cover. By the time the shooting slowed, 4 of their men were down. We'd lost one of the ranch hands, gut shot and bleeding out in the corner. The Carsons were both wounded, one in the arm, the other limping from a bullet in the leg. O'Reilly's face was grey with exhaustion, sweat dripping from his brow. And still, the stranger stood, untouched, as his men pulled back. The sun dipped low. Shadows stretched long. And then, silence. "They'll come again," Caleb muttered, wiping blood from his cheek. "Tonight?" I asked. "Or tomorrow? Doesn't matter. They're not done." I nodded grimly. He was right. When the others settled in for the night, I slipped outside, needing air. The street was eerily quiet, the bodies of the dead already dragged away. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust. And that's when I saw it. Pinned to the stable door, a piece of parchment, written in a bold, elegant hand. "Return the child, or watch them all burn." No signature. None needed. I crumpled the paper in my fist. Rage boiled in my chest. But beneath it, colder and sharper, was fear. Because the handwriting wasn't that of a hired gun. It wasn't the scrawl of a rancher or a drifter. It was precise, aristocratic, the kind of hand taught in boarding schools and polished halls. This wasn't just some vendetta. It was a claim and the men coming for us wouldn't stop until they got what they believed was theirs. Inside, Grace rocked the baby to sleep, her lips pressed to the child's forehead, whispering soft words I couldn't hear. For the first time, I let myself wonder, what if we couldn't win? What if the bloodline pulling on this child was stronger than my will, stronger than every bullet I could fire? I shook the thought off, loaded my rifle again. Let them come. If this baby was the key they wanted, then I'd be the lock they couldn't break. Not while I still had breath in my lungs. The town was quieter than a graveyard after the shootout. Folks didn't gather in the saloon anymore, didn't linger on porches. They kept their doors barred, their lamps dim, and their children inside. The strangers' men had bled us once, and everyone knew they'd be back. Grace and I stayed close to the livery, keeping watch. The baby never stopped fussing, restless even in her sleep, as though she knew the storm building around her. It was Reverend Caleb who finally gave us the truth. He came to us late that night, coat dusted from travel, eyes heavy. He'd ridden out to meet a man across the county line, someone who once served in the great houses back east, someone who knew names. The child's father, Caleb said, his voice raw, is Lord Henry Ashford. Grace stiffened, clutching the baby tighter. I'd heard the name before. Everyone had. Ashford wasn't just rich. He was untouchable. Land, railroads, political strings that stretched to Washington itself. She is his heir, Caleb continued. But her mother ran before she could be bound to him in marriage. She wanted her daughter free, not raised as property of his empire. That is why they hunt her. The child is more than blood. She is legitimacy. With her, Ashford's power extends even further. Without her, it crumbles. I felt the words like a hammer. This wasn't a feud. It was empire versus defiance. And we had put ourselves square in the middle. Grace's eyes glistened. So if they take her... They won't, I said, cutting her off. My voice was steel, though my heart was pounding. Not while I breathe. But the truth gnawed at me. Men like Ashford didn't lose. They crushed. They burned. And the stranger? He wasn't just a hunter. He was Ashford's hand. Cold, patient, precise. As Caleb left, he gave me a look that lingered heavy on my shoulders. Mason, he said quietly, when the time comes, protecting her may mean more than your life. It may mean your soul. I didn't answer, because deep down, I already knew he was right. The horizon glowed faint with campfires that night, dozens of them. Ashford's army was here, waiting for the dawn. The final reckoning had come. Dawn broke over the hills like a threat. The campfires we'd seen the night before burned brighter now, hundreds of men arrayed with rifles, horses restless, the stranger pacing at their edge. I tightened my hands on the rifle, feeling the weight of every shot, every heartbeat. Grace stood beside me, hope bundled against her chest, eyes wide but trusting. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew we were her anchors, and that was enough. We couldn't wait. We had to act before Ashford's men poured into town. We'd set traps, barricades, anything we could, but we were outnumbered 10-1. Yet fear wasn't going to win this day. Love was stronger. The first wave hit as the sun cleared the ridge. Horses screamed, men shouted, gunfire erupted in sharp staccato. I dove behind the barricade, firing into the chaos, each shot deliberate. Grace stayed low, whispering to Hope, rocking her against the pounding in her chest. Then the stranger appeared in the smoke. Calm, unyielding, eyes locked on me. He moved like a shadow, precise and unstoppable. I knew I couldn't just outshoot him. I had to outthink him. We circled him, drew him into the narrow streets where our traps funneled the horses, our barricades funneled the men. I saw O'Reilly, bleeding from a leg wound but still fighting, holding 2 attackers off with sheer brute strength. The Carson boys covered him, shouting with reckless courage. And then it was him, Ashford himself, tall, arrogant, his voice cutting across the battlefield. "Hand her over, Reed. This child is mine by law, by blood, by right." I spat the dust from my mouth. "Aim steady. Blood doesn't raise a child. Love does. And she's ours." He laughed, cold and sharp. "You think you can defy me? You're nothing." But he didn't know one thing. Hope had already chosen. Her tiny hand reached out from Grace's arms, and when she saw me, she babbled, "Papa." In that instant, I felt a surge I didn't know I had left. Every loss I'd suffered, every heartbreak, every sleepless night, they all converged into one single determination. She would not be taken from us. We fought through the morning. Bullets tore wood, horses screamed, but our resolve didn't falter. The stranger moved toward Hope, but a sudden crash. O'Reilly sent a trap rolling, throwing him off balance, and he was down. Ashford realized too late that the child was more than his claim. She was a living testament to choice, to love, to the family that saved her. The townspeople, emboldened by our defense, joined in, rising up against his men. The imbalance of fear versus justice tipped the scales. By noon, the battlefield fell silent. Ashford's men were retreating, the stranger taken prisoner, and the threat broken. I held my rifle loose in one hand, Grace clutching Hope tightly, her tiny face flushed with excitement, not fear. We were alive. We had won. Hope looked up at me, laughing between babbles, and for the first time in a decade, I smiled without restraint. The baby we'd rescued, the child who had healed our hearts, had chosen us. And in that moment I knew, no title, no bloodline, no fortune could ever matter more than this. We walked home together, the town slowly returning to life around us. Grace held Hope close, I rode beside them, and the horizon stretched wide and free. The past had been cruel, the present hard, but the future, our future, was ours to shape. Hope, our hope, had survived. We had survived. And for the first time, I felt a peace I thought would never return. Because love had conquered everything. If you were in Mason Reed's boots, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. While you're here, explore the other stories waiting for you on screen. You never know which one might capture your heart next.